I want to invite you to take a moment at the outset to consider something, which is what do you already know about Holocaust Diaries? I'm guessing you actually have some familiarity with them, that you've certainly heard of the Diary of Anne Frank. Maybe you've even read a version of it. And in the next few minutes, I want to invite you to think in potentially new ways about Holocaust Diaries, about Anne Frank's diary included. As much as diaries actually appear to be accessible sources, they make it possible to relate to the Holocaust, to think about it in personal terms. Diaries are far richer and more complex than they appear. My goal today is to impart some strategies for reading and for analyzing Holocaust diaries. First, I want to start out with giving you a sense, because I think it's really important to understand, a sense of the extent of the practice, how common diary writing was among Jews in Europe during the Holocaust. Anne Frank's diary is one of hundreds of diaries that were salvaged from the wreckage of the Holocaust. For many European Jews, diary writing was one response to living in the shadow of annihilation. Diarists came from many different backgrounds, and they wrote diaries in different wartime contexts. Some wrote diaries in ghettos, some wrote in towns and cities under Nazi occupation where there were no ghettos. People wrote diaries in hiding. They wrote in bunkers, they wrote in crawl spaces and barns. In my research, I even came across a diary that was written in an open field by a couple who were separated from their young son. They wrote a diary to their son in this field. In rare instances, people recorded diaries in concentration camps and even among them in Auschwitz-Birkenau. Through their diaries, Jewish people attempted to comprehend the unimaginable genocide as it threatened to engulf them and the meaning of their own lives in this radically altered world. In addition, diary writers sought to provide the future with a written testimony of what was in the process of being destroyed, about themselves, about their people, and about the world around them. Now, unlike Anne Frank's diary, most diaries that were penned by Jews during the Holocaust have remained unknown, unpublished, and unread. After the war, some were deposited in archives and libraries. Others were stashed away in attics, in closets. We have to assume that most were lost or destroyed, and that unto themselves, they constitute a response. Diaries are both windows onto victims' responses to their persecution and murder, and they are themselves part of their response. The Nazis wanted to destroy the evidence of the genocide that they were carrying out, and Jews wrote diaries in part to ensure that the memory of their extermination would not become the Nazis' last victim. Diaries constitute a distinct type of document, as I've already mentioned, because they're personal, but it's more than that, because people who kept diaries did so without knowing the end. They're contemporaneous documents, they unfold in time, and in that sense, they're quite different from memoirs or oral histories, which were recorded after the war. They actually capture change over time, and they do so from the vantage point of one person and one person's perception. In this respect, you could say that they were written in real time. And a consequence is that they interfere with us, 21st century readers, our presentist bias, our assumption in the sense that it is we who know best because we have the vantage of hindsight in looking back on this history. Diaries inspire reflection on what it means to be on the inside of a disaster. How does one recognize disaster as such without that critical distance? What's the difference between ordinary and extraordinary violence? What's the difference between ordinary and extraordinary suffering? I want to discuss, after giving you this sense that I have of ways of thinking about the phenomenon of diary writing, to discuss how to read a diary and types of questions to consider. And I'm going to focus here on 3 questions. Probably the first, it's obvious, but the first question to pose upon reading a diary is, who was the diarist? What do we know? What can we know about the person who wrote the diary that you have to read in front of you? Well, if a diary's been published, then usually the person who prepared the diary's publication, the editor of the diary, conducted as much research as possible about the diarist in question. That editor, depending on what was available in and around the diary, might be able to tell you the circumstances in which the diary was written and also key biographical information about the diarist. But even if the diary that you're reading was published, and even if you do have an editor's introduction, investigate further, mine the diary. Try to determine for yourself, from your own reading of the diary, all of these kinds of things about who the diarist was, when and where the person was born, what their age was at the time of the Holocaust, their gender, their family situation, sexuality. Try to determine the person's level of education, maybe what their profession was prior to the war. Know what language the diary was written in if you're reading it in translation. Try also to determine, was this person religiously observant? In what ways? Can you get a sense of their political ideas, of their political affiliations? And one further aspect of a person's biography that we don't normally consider, but it's actually highly relevant as you're reading a person's Holocaust-era diary, is whether that person had written a diary previously. Were they a veteran diarist? Did the person have a longstanding habit of keeping a diary that predated the coming to power of the Nazis, for example, in Germany in 1933, or the start of the war in 1939? Because if we have a sense of their relationship to diary writing, that's part of understanding an answer to the second question that you need to consider, which is why a person wrote a diary. What did it mean to them? So one aspect of thinking about this question, why did a particular person, the person whose diary you are reading, why did they write a diary, is to consider who they imagined would read their diary. Some diarists wrote for themselves. They hoped their entries would remain private. But most Holocaust diarists actually wrote with other imagined readers in mind. Which other readers? Did they write for people they knew, for their children, for their siblings? Did they write for strangers whom they imagined would relate to what they were experiencing, maybe for fellow Jewish people? Or did they write for anyone in the outside world? It's a phrase that comes up in many diaries, this notion of the outside world. As I've mentioned, as a historian, I'm especially attuned to how things change over time. And so part of what you might also want to consider is if a diarist's motivations for writing a diary changed over time, if their imagined reader changed over time, and why? Why the change? A third and last question or line of inquiry that I'll bring up here is about whether and in what ways the diary offers a window onto the past. What topics did the diarist write about? What do we learn about those topics in and through the perspective afforded by the diarist? I've selected one diary to analyze in light of these remarks on how to read a diary. It's the diary of a woman named Irene Hauser. Her diary consists of one notebook. It was just over 100 pages. It was written in the German language, and she wrote it in the Lodz Ghetto in Poland. The entries that Irene Hauser recorded in this notebook covered just 3 months. She wrote them in July, August, and September of 1942. And I also want to mention here that it's important to know that the diary exists. It's a material object. It's not just a scan on the computer. It's not a published text only. The original diary actually is housed or lives in the archives that are part of the Emanuel Ringelblum Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw, Poland. It's an archive that was established by Polish Jewish Holocaust survivors after the war. And you can find an English translation, but only of excerpts of this diary on the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum's website, Experiencing History. I'm going to jump right in to reading this. So let's look at the diary's first pages. The first entry, the first few pages of a diary, are often actually highly significant, as they are in this case, because what you find there often is that a diary writer includes explicit mention of why they are embarking on writing a diary on their imagined reader. So it's important to note this at the outset, and then to analyze whether they stayed the same or they changed. And we find in Irene Hauser's first few pages quite a lot about who she was and why she decided to write. So first what we have, we're confronted with a series of names and dates and addresses. And in all, actually, she recorded 8 pages of names and addresses. First, she put her own name and a mini genealogy of her family. Why? What might that tell us? And note, I'm saying here what might that tell us, because we are surmising, we're interpreting the evidence. Maybe the diary was intended for herself. But then you might wonder, was she worried she would forget these addresses and dates, including the date of her mother's death? Maybe it suggests that Irene Hauser wanted this information to be preserved, to be known by someone else, someone reading her diary. Who? There's more here. She tells us that she was, quote, evacuated with husband and child, unquote, to the Lodz Ghetto in Poland in October 1941. We learned she had a brother in Vienna, she had a sister in Belgrade, she had another sister in England, and maybe another sibling as well, a woman she mentions who appears like she might have been her sister, who was a dentist in Vienna. And now when we turn the page, we learn her initial reason for writing this diary. Quote, "This book is meant to reach my sister in England, Josephine Carleton, née or born Hacker," unquote. If the diary was meant for her sister, we might ask why she thought it necessary to include all these other names and addresses of family members and friends. Did she worry that the person who found it might not send it directly to her sister in England? Perhaps she worried that her sister might not have had the most recent addresses of their relatives, so maybe those addresses were for her sister. Another explanation, she wrote that her sister got married and emigrated in 1941 and that she, Irene, has lost her sister's address. What other reasons might we come up with to explain these first 8 pages of names and addresses? We also learn here quite a lot about Irene. When you think about in these first few pages some of the other information, we learn that before being deported, she had lived in the Austrian capital city of Vienna. We discover that she was married. She was married to a man named Leo, and they had 1 child. Later on in the diary, we learn that she was born in 1901, so she was about 41 years old when she wrote this diary. We learn her husband was a couple of years older than she was, and that their son Eric was 6. And she called her son Booby throughout the diary. As we continue reading, Irene Hauser's diary furnishes us with a devastating portrait of starvation and family dissolution in the Lodz Ghetto. Her diary imparts a different understanding of starvation than the photographs of emaciated victims in ghettos and concentration camps. Hers is the voice of a person suffering from malnutrition herself. It's not the gaze of an outsider. She describes how she and her young son spent hours standing in line. They stood in line at points of distribution for food rations. She writes about their weakened states, about how much energy they had to expend to get downstairs and stand on their feet for hours, and how they were often sent away empty-handed, despite the fact that they were in possession of the necessary food ration coupons. On 1 page of her diary, she kept a list of what she called hunger days. These were days when they had nothing to eat. And the list is long. And over time, it seems she gave up the effort to record the dates clearly. From exhaustion, was she running out of space on the page? In addition to this evidence of social inequality in the ghetto and of the situation of starvation, we also are confronted in Hauser's diary with an intimate description of the effects of starvation on her family, on one woman's family. Her relationship with her husband Leo was strained to the breaking point, and in entry after entry, she expresses her resentment toward Leo. He was eating more than his share of the family rations. He was prioritizing his own hunger over their sons. Irene recorded her bitterness when Leo would eat up all of the bread that was supposed to be for the 3 of them and was supposed to last for days. And she writes about Leo squandering their last money and possessions. We learn in Irene's diary also about what limited recourse she had to change her situation. She actually appears to have tried to separate from Leo in July of 1942. She tried to move out, but to move out meant that she needed to find another living situation, which was something that could only be granted her by ghetto authorities. And when she was turned down, she was forced to stay with her husband. Hauser herself summed up the major theme of her diary without that vantage of hindsight in real time. She wrote in her sort of staccato prose style, quote, "The child cries hunger, the father cigarettes, the mother wants to die, family life in the ghetto," unquote. Her diary contains not a shred of hope for her own survival. There's no redemptive message about the meaning of genocide in her diary. In an early entry, in fact, she recorded that these are her words, "It would have been best if they had buried us outside on arrival, because one feels the atrocity of this life every hour. Allegedly, the people who were taken away from here between the 5th and 15th of May were gassed and so exterminated," unquote. In the final entries of the diary, Hauser writes about an event that in the history of the Lodz Ghetto has come to be referred to as the children's transport. It's an event that in the history of the Holocaust and beyond the history of the Holocaust, in philosophy and ethics, it's an event that's taken on tremendous importance. What happened is that children under the age of 10 and also adults over the age of 65 and also hospital patients, it was about 20,000 people in all. They were separated out from the rest of the ghetto population over the course of about a week in September of 1942. They were deported from Lodz. They were deported to an extermination camp, Chelmno, and in Chelmno they were killed in mobile gas vans and their bodies were dumped in graves in the woods in the vicinity of the camp, in mass graves. Her entries are evidence of how one mother and the people around her understood and how they reacted to this action on a day-to-day basis. Her diary ends during the children's transport. 2 days before the end of the so-called children's transport, she stopped recording entries. Why did she stop? In an entry from September 7th, and then again a day later in an entry from the 8th, Hauser wrote that, quote, "Bubi," her son, "will not go with me of his own free will," unquote. She doesn't tell us what happened next. Most likely her son was captured. We don't know for certain. We don't know for certain about the final days of his life. She didn't tell us, and there's no death record. Indeed, so much about Irene Hauser remains unknown and unknowable. No traces exist of her husband Leo, or of her son, Eric, after that last entry in the diary. We have so many unanswered questions about them, and that's part of history. It's asking questions, it's figuring out what we can learn from a source, what we can't learn, and how to keep looking for answers. We learn to recognize what we don't know, the limitations of a source, and the limits of our knowledge. It would be possible to pick up any Holocaust diary and pose the types of questions that I've raised here. Each diary is particular, but each also speaks to larger themes. We read them to anchor different histories. We read them to anchor histories of racism and anti-Semitism, assimilation and marginality, exclusion, and genocide. We also read them to develop modes of listening and speaking, modes that are respectful and self-caring, about things like trauma, memory, and survival. How to talk about how to narrate trauma, how to hear it, how to listen to accounts of trauma, and what genres are most appropriate. In most diaries, it's abundantly clear that the diarists were aware of the fact that they were witnessing and experiencing history in the making. When we read Holocaust diaries, we reflect on the past, but we might also ask, how do we know when we are experiencing a historical moment? Many Jewish people's reaction was to write it all down. What are ours? What are our reactions?